struggling with. Let's jump now to the Gemara. So what is, maybe you read the first paragraph or so, and then we can just raise a couple of quick questions. Those of you can be looking. Patrick, why don't you do that? Why was it necessary?
Why was it necessary for the divine law to mention both thorns, stacks, standing corn, and field? They're all necessary. For if the divine law has mentioned only thorns, I might have said that it was only in the case of thorns that the divine law imposed liability, because fire is found often among them, and carelessness in regard to them is frequent. Whereas the stacks, which are not often on fire, and in respect to which negligence is not usual, I might have held that there is no liability.
You notice that this is already something that's absolutely striking. Normally, when a Gemara starts, is asking questions about the formulation of the Mishnah. And here we have a question about all the details of the scriptural text, right? And it won't come back to that language of the Mishnah till the very end when it's a theological. So part of this purpose is to talk about the hyper-rationality or the specificity of the biblical text, which is trying to deal with all circumstances. So go on.
But why was standing corn necessary to be mentioned? It teaches that just as standing corn is in an open place, so is everything which is in an open space subject to the same law. But according to Rabbi Judah, who imposes liability also to concealed articles damaged by fire, why did standing corn be mentioned? To include anything possessing statue. Whence did the other rabbis include anything possessing statue? They derived this from the word or, placed before the standing corn. In Rabbi Judah, he needed the word or as a disjunctive. Whence then did the other rabbis derive the disjunction? They derived it from the word or placed before the field. And Rabbi Judah, he held it because the divine law inserted or before the standing corn, it also inserted or before the field. Why was field needed to be inserted? To include the case of fire lapping his native plowed field and grazing his stone. But why did the divine law not say on the field? In which case, other than they were still necessary. For if the divine law had said field only, I might have said that anything in the field would come under the same law, but not any other thing. It was therefore indicated to us that this is not so.
Okay. So what kind of meta statement can we make about this first line of questioning? Okay? So this first part of the Gemara is concerned to ask certain kind of cultural and legal questions, right? And what is its larger purpose? Because we want to get a sense of what the logic, what the concern is, and the first level of the Gemara, then to see where Levinas's intervention is going to be. So from this perspective of the Rabbinic Academy, right? These are a series of discourses within the Rabbinic Academy. How would you give some kind of meta statement about what the rabbinic task is here as it's deliberating on the formulation of the Torah text, of the text in Exodus?
And this may be very obvious, but it seems that this really is delineating exactly what the responsibilities are of the person in the case of something else being their burning somebody else's property, delineating exactly what exactly are the limits of what's been burned, what's been damaged, and what responsibility.
Anybody else before? Yeah? Granted here.
Maybe we should wait.
It sounds like
curious, sir. Curious, sir.
Okay.
Okay. It's an attack by Donald Trump.
Donald Duck.
By Donald Trump. Okay.
I guess one can regard this as part of that the Rebecca attempt to establish, I would say, a logical structure of halacha. So it's basically, it's not only about asking why, about the redundancy of the Bible, but trying to kind of provide an analysis of the text, of the biblical text, in a way which will basically ascribe or establish within the text, within the reading of the biblical text, a firm, established logical structure.
Okay.
So you know more about this than I do, obviously. But it seems to me that it's both legal, as you were saying, like to extract the maximal legal implications, but also there is like a exegetical, maybe theological purpose of trying to show that it's not redundant. It makes sure that every word of the text has a certain degree of sanctity, as opposed to saying, oh, this whole passage just has one point which along the line would have serious negative exegetical implications.
Yeah. So I think that in that sense, Rachel's intervention precedes Tzvi's. And you can see from the language of the Gemara, it says, why does Scripture say X, Y, and Z? In other words, what is the presumed intention of the lawgiver? Right? So the notion here is that if we're talking about agency, which will then become the ethical question of responsibility, but it's starting at the level of legal agency. What was the purpose of the divine lawgiver for having to specify multiple topics as opposed to one or the other? And how do various sages try to understand the intentionality of the formulation of the law? Then it moves to that next level of what will be the legal framing and what are the legal extent of any particular term. So if it's chosen these separate items and it's separated them either this or that or the other, what is to be included within the framework of the intentionality of the law? Okay? So the assumption is that the divine lawgiver is setting up a structure of agency and areas of responsibility that are clearly distinct from one from another, and these are meant to understand different dimensions of revealed, concealed, direct, indirect, space, and normal things in space, and other things that might be in space. So you might think that a normal thing in space would only be a tree, but then it might include stones, it could include an animal, it could include many other kinds of issues. So each one of these now becomes, as it were, a paradigmatic assertion of the structure. Okay? Anybody else want to add anything?
Well, in a certain sense, it sets an ontological premise. This is what happens in a given situation. If fire is set, this is what is bound to happen within a given border of situations.
Right.
Which would then entail a certain variety.
But you notice part of the problem is that in the biblical formulation, the notion of the subject or the agent doesn't come till the very end. Right? It's focusing on this eruption of secondary effects, right? And then it only comes to the subject at the very end, whereas the Mishnah flips it the other way around, because it's more immediately concerned not with a spontaneous action, right? There's the first one talks about if a fire kind of breaks forth, and then you sort of have indirect possibilities presented before the direct igniter of the fire. The Mishnah is more concerned to talk first about agency and then to get at indirect agency in a much more logical way. Okay, so anybody else?
Just a small remark. It's also interesting the fact that the Mishnah replaces the details of the biblical verse instead of Chutzim
Right. Yeah.
yeah, fine. And I mean the details it just replaces it with different elements, different types. You know, the trees, the stones, and I would say the fire, which kind of is a bit field. It seems perhaps that it attempts to identify the details in the biblical, identify them with particular principles, particular issues, which could be actually developed later on, or I would say, from which we can actually derive larger, I would say, categories, or larger, I would say, dimensions of property in general, not specifically with regard to.
So in other words, instead of simply saying thorns and stacks and corn issues, they've now taken certain kinds of other of issues. So the stone, the ground, the earth, and trees. Different kinds of ways of things that might be in property. So in other words, it serves the legal understanding of larger categories in a different way.
And that's the kind of replacing the detail. I mean, identify each detail with like a category of property.
Okay.
It's kind of okay.
So for the first immediate purpose, we can say is that the Mishnah has taken a certain rationality of Scripture and taken it to a higher level of rationality and order and abstraction, right? And all this is going to serve Levinas's larger purpose, because he's going to try to really show that the subject that's really of concern is the irrationality of elemental fire. And if law is trying to contain it under certain circumstances, the move to Agadah is going to be concerned with a much more elemental anxiety that can't be contained by the structure of law. Okay? But the first part is, now if as we'll see, if the intriguing thing that for Levinas, although he doesn't have it in this particular text, but his assumption is that a deeper sense, the first level of responsibility that we find in the scriptural text is also reflecting a concern of agency. And the first formulation is taking place in terms of social political law. But the deeper anxiety of what agency means still remains, and it breaks forth in the context of the Talmudic discussion of the Agadah. In other words, for him, the deeper human notion of what agency means in the social world first finds a level of reasonable legal expression at the level of law. But in his desire to establish a phenomenology of responsibility, that deeper pre-rational feeling that has its first order expression in law is retained and breaks forth anew in the Agadah in terms of this struggling with the issue of agency. Otherwise, you can't really understand Levinas's larger purpose. In other words, he sees law as a first-order translation of a pre-thematic concern. The pre-thematic concern is the worry of whether the world is rational, ordered, and agency can in fact be accounted for in legal terms. But it begins with a pre-thematic worry, a concern of assigning responsibility and whether the world seems to work in a kind of formulated way. So at the level of law, we're able to contain it, right? But his working assumption as a phenomenon, in terms of the phenomenology of the rabbinic legal material, is to say the same way there is a horizon of concern, human concern, that has realized itself at the level of law, which is logical and reasonable and so on and so forth, that pre-thematic worry about reasonableness, agency, and responsibility doesn't go away, right? And it will break through in his understanding by these concatenation or the series of little episodes, which from his point of view are not just folkloristic throwaways, but they've been assembled here to kind of bring up that deeper unconscious of the concern of the irrationality of existence that the law tried to tamp down from the very beginning. Okay? So we'll see that from his point of view, the larger reading of the text is that the Agadah allows us to return to that earlier level of concern that law has already somehow contained. But it's important for us to see at the beginning that we're already seeing at the cultural level 2 orders, or actually 3 orders, of rational signification at the level of legal thinking, right? So the first is the particular casuistic, if-then structure of the biblical law, what we call casuistic law. If such and such a thing happens, then this is the responsibility. So that is a kind of rational structure of possibility, condition, and accountability. Okay? The second order is the nomistic, or the normative new formulation that's coming down through the human tradition. Let's say if the first order is presented as a divine formulation, the second is a human formulation, and the formulation, following Tzvi saying, is it's a reformulation of the structure of the sentence, changing the topics completely, so that the topics become capable of a much larger logical analysis. So we're going up another level of rational structure which law needs, right? And then the third level is the discourse in the legal schools, which is going to take the formulation in Scripture and the formulation in the Mishnah as their starting point, but wants to be absolutely clear the relationship between the formulations in the Torah text and whether it's covering stones. In other words, stones would be something that's hidden as opposed to something that's surface. And they're making all kinds of correlations to understand limit, relationship, and distinction. Whereas our text wasn't doing that, and that is now at the level of human voice. So we see actually 3 different kinds of voices too that's going to emerge. And then Levinas is going to be that 4th voice, right? So the first voice is the divine voice, or the Mosaic voice, and it's presenting casuistic law. The second is the abstract cultural voice, giving nomistic structure at another level of reflection. In other words, that Mishnah couldn't have come into place unless there had already been many courts and many reformulations and many abstractions. That's already reflecting a whole level of cultural abstraction in the legal courts dealing with the biblical text. And then the third level is where individual sages are trying to think rationally about the structure that's come down to them. So we have a third level that is a meta-communication through a series of questions, right? Why this, why not that, etc., etc. To try to understand from the point of view of human jurists to try to decode the rationality of the divine or the Mosaic lawgiver, right? So we're actually now at 3 levels of legal reasoning that have taken us into the schools, which are now trying to formulate that. And then when we come, which we'll pick up now with the immediate shift, we'll come back to Levinas in a second, of Shmuel Bar Nachmani, a classic Baal Agadita, a classic Agadist. There is an unstated segue immediately from the legal material to the legendary material, right? And as we go through the material, you'll see we could probably account for the linkage in a very different way, but Levinas is going to try to understand the teaching of the text as releasing another level of ethical worry, right? That the ethical worry that's contained at the legal level now breaks forth at the larger ethical and theological level. But it was always there. In other words, whether the world has order, can be contained, can be given rational. So he's trying to, by getting back to this pre-thematic worry, he's going to allow us to try to recapture a first philosophy, which is going to be that responsibility for the other. Okay, so let's first now see. Let's go back to these topics in the Agada, or the theological or legendary material. And remember, at the first level, let's just see, a lot of it is just simply odd folkloristic materials about sickness and demons and so on and so forth, but they deal with irrational structures that seem to kind of float around in an unrational and unordered way. So we have to try to figure out, like, what would seem to be the ordering principle of the editor of the Gemara, and then how does Levinas try to figure out what is the ordering principle of these units as well. Okay, so let's pick up. Who wants to pick up with the reading? Maybe Rachel, why don't you go on to Rabbi Samuel Bar Nachmani?
Rabbi Samuel Bar Nachmani stated that Rabbi Yohanan said, calamity comes upon the world only when there are wicked persons in the world, and it always begins with the righteous, as it says, if fire break out and catch in thorns. When does fire break out? Only when thorns are found nearby. It always begins, however, with the righteous, as it says, so that the stack of corn was consumed. It does not say, and it would consume the stack of corn, but that the stack of corn was consumed, which means that the stack of corn had already been consumed.
Yeah. So now notice, just before we look at this a little bit more carefully, undoubtedly you can see the stylistic framing of our sugya, of the pericope. Because if you look we've moved from a legal text, and although this is not presented here as a sermon, it's a sermon that combines theology and law the same way the final one does, right? The final one concludes by saying, can you integrate a legal reading of our biblical text with a theological reading of the biblical text? How it concludes. In fact, that's what's going on in this episode too. It's a double reading that's going to be using the legal text to talk about an ethical, theological question. So the framing of this theological material is at the beginning and the end of this unit. In the middle will be a series of further disturbances. This is still at a level of a kind of rationalizing order. In other words, what Levinas is going to pick up here, undoubtedly from the first sermon, is that the first sermon about the theodicy or evil breaks that uses the legal text is transforming evil and the justification of evil in rational terms. It's really, as he will say, it's giving a kind of ordered structure to the irrational. So the homilist, Shmuel Bar Nachmani, has used the legal text to talk about the sequence of how evil breaks out, right? It breaks out because of evil things, but it also consumes the righteous, right? So that begins to open up the logical question of why the righteous punished if it begins with the evil who've done that, right? And a lot of Levinas's pushback is to be extreme, and he has many essays against this, about the impossibility and the indecency to use theodicy as a way of talking about the world of theology. But notice, he's pushed in this direction precisely because of the way the tradition has presented materials that have used Exodus 21, beginning of the unit, begins to open up the rationality of theodicy and what Levinas will later deal with as the irrationality that he wants to kind of retrieve. That's not going to be the. Let's first see. Let's go back to Shmuel bar Nachmanides. So they translate calamity, but in fact the Gemara it calls it puranut, which could be understood to be punishment. It's not exactly clear whether this is. I think I would tend to read this where punishment or divine punishment. It's not. In other words, it's not simply at the level of happenstance, right? Because otherwise you can't understand the sequence of the homily here and what's bothered. So it says, when puranut comes upon the world, or let's say when a destruction comes upon the world, understood to be a divine destruction. It only comes when there are wicked persons in the world, and it always begins with the righteous. So this presumably was some kind of a tradition that Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani is trying to understand. How is it that the righteous get caught up in destructions in the world that seem to be because of truly evil people, right? So he goes on to say, so now he quotes, the homily is using the structure of the biblical text, but now the homilist has transformed the hypothetical if into a logical if. It becomes a when. You notice what the homilist has done. The homilist has already turned a legal hypothetical, right? If such and such a thing takes place, then this takes place, right? Right? But from the point of view of this new theological order, gives us another level of theological rationality. The now means when this takes place. He understands not as if, but when. So it's a totally it's a radical rereading of the biblical law for the sake of the theology. Because it's not saying if such and such then happens, but when this takes place, it begins here and it goes on to that. In other words, it's giving a new understanding of the sequence. It begins with the kotzim, which are the people who are the thorns who force that, and it ends with koma, which are the upright ones. In other words, that's how he's reading it allegorically, right? He's reading the legal text in the first instance allegorically, right? So it moves, as it were, from kotzim, which are thorns, which would be understood to be the bramble of people, the evil ones. It goes to the gadish, which people who are, say, solid and organized and stacked up in a certain kind of way. And it goes to koma, which is not understood as the koma of corn, but the koma of the upright ones, right? So he's not spelling out I'm sure when he originally gave this in the synagogue, he spelled out each one of these allegorical elements. We simply have it as a highly condensed text. But he's now turned the biblical text now into a new order of rationality, right? That the sequence of elements in nature which is described in Scripture are now not understood at the level of legal elements, but they're understood. The fire is understood as an intentional punishment. It's not just something that breaks out without agency. The fire now is intentional, right? Hamavir et ha-be'era, right? And that's why the last homily at the end will talk about God says, I was the one who was ma'avir. I was the one who caused the fire. Therefore, I will pay the penalty. I will surround Jerusalem with Aish. God says, I take responsibility. But notice, at this first level, we now have an attempt to transform legal logic into another level of rationality, which is to say, theological rationality. And the most compelling case of theological rationality is theodicy. And for Levinas, it's the most obscene. And so he's gonna come to try to get at the obscenity of it. But first, just look at what it says. When it breaks out, but don't forget, this is going to break out with puranut. So presumably it's with divine intention. Only with the thorns found nearby. It always begins, however, with the righteous. It always begins with the righteous, etc., that the stack of corn was consumed, which means that the stack of corn had already been consumed. Okay? So now he's going to meditate on that. That's going to be a springboard for him. That it's a punishment for their super righteousness that they didn't take responsibility for the other. But he's going to come back to that because he's going to now trying to flip that rationality of the formulation into a way of talking about a new level of responsibility. But what I want you to begin to see is these multiple orders of reception and transformation, right? Our Gemara is now giving us a series of mental transformations of this law and how it's entering into different epistemic structures, right? And it's going from the legal to the sequential, which is now theological. But it's still presented, now nothing is stated here as a meta-communication. It will require Levinas to say it's still at a level of rationality. There's a ratio here. And he's going to be offended by the ratio, so he's going to try to deconstruct that, because he's going to indicate that there is a deeper concern beneath that rational level to get you to that level of primary responsibility, right?
I'm just curious. Do you think there's kind of a potential play of the sequencing so far? That on the one hand, you have the first eating the phenomenon going on, first eating the consumption of the dish.
Yeah.
At the same time, in terms of tense, right? So you have past tense with regard to the dish, which comes after, right? The sequence comes after the same but for the time it happened before.
Yeah.
It's kind of favorite.
Yeah, but you have to see, like, as we'll see from the issue. Let's put it. So when Levinas is going to try to understand what is the horizon of concern, and he's going to try to reformulate the horizon of concern in modern terms. So he's going to he's implying that the horizon of concern of Shmuel bar Nachmani, which is not stated here, is this concern that it's not just that thorns are the easiest for flame to latch onto and to ignite, but it actually already begins with the righteous. And so he's concerned with why the righteous are consumed when the punishment is initially for the evil ones. So his horizon of concern is the apparent injustice, and he's using the law to kind of give a justification for that.
Yeah,
So in other words, we have an implied theodicy here that's underlying this homily about the law. That the righteous, although it always will break out with the easiestly consumed item, which are the thorns, it had already begun with the righteous.
Yeah.
And so the question is, why are the righteous sort of consumed by other people's guilt? And so for Levinas, that will allow him to move past that question to the fact that it's because they didn't take account of their neighbor. He'll take this to another ethical level. We have to ask, is that move simply Levinas adding a new layer, or is there something, in other words, is he continuing at another level of philosophical reflection, which Shmuel bar Nachmani is already doing? In other words, Shmuel bar Nachmani is trying to give a rational theodicy using this legal text for understanding, which is not, I mean, it's not in the text. It's a hypothetical reading. From that point of view, Levinas' deconstructing of that is in the same tradition. It's using the legal text to undermine, or the whole Gemara to undermine that. The question that we have to kind of see is there some cultural validity for seeing Levinas as a later day commentator on these materials? Or is he just coming in from left field? Right? I think it's a little bit of both, as we'll see, but there's no more reason to deconstruct it than there is for Shmuel bar Nachmani to a hyper-theological reading, right? It's just, Shmuel bar Nachmani appears in the Gemara text, so you sort of assume that he's more legitimate, but Levinas is in the tradition of interpretation. The question is whether he's broken the frame of concern, and in doing so, does he have legitimacy? And he'll claim that all these other materials about disease and mashchit, demons, and so on and so forth, is already deconstructing the notion of rationality. That there's already a much deeper irrational concern that's worrying the editor of the Gemara, who includes this, that allows him to deconstruct the rationality of punishment. Because you have to understand where Levinas is coming from. He's going to tell you that the logic of the Talmudic text is going to be his own justification for what he's planning to do. In other words, it's precisely this collection of material that a historical scholar would look at the next series of elements as simply a series of associations of fever, demons, disease, famine, that are in part using features that we know from the earlier text, and they're just a string of associations. For Levinas, he's saying that first order of worry, theological worry that Shmuel bar Nachmani is getting at, has a deeper level of worry, right? That demonic things consume all people all at once, and there's no rationality to it, right? As we'll see how he argues. If that's the case, by the time that Levinas wants to help us say that the correct reading of that text is to undermine the very notion of doing a rational reading of that text, it's already been done by the chain of associations in the sugya, in the pericope. In other words, it's already reflecting a deep pre-thematic anxiety about how craziness consumes people irrespective of their behavior, right? And so he's saying that is the deepest concern. He will then say the only way to deal with that is not to explain the anxiety, but to respond to the world with an absolute responsibility, as if to say the only way you could ever stop insanity that breaks out irrationally is to take upon yourself the responsibility for the other. And from that point of view, his deconstruction is legitimated by the deconstruction of rationality that's going to be taking place in the text by these series of associations. Now, you have to give him the notion that the editor of our text is not just collecting a series of random materials, some of which are linked up to the same verse, or they're simply dealing with all kinds of craziness. There's fire, that's an elemental thing. There's demonic plague, that's an elemental thing. Famine is an elemental thing. So he's going to say, so why are these things all linked up here? Because there is a deeper horizon of concern. And the deeper horizon of concern, of course, matches Levinas's concern as a Holocaust thinker. In other words, when things break out, they consume everyone, and there is no rationality to it. So it's a modern reading, but he's going to say that perception of the all-consuming nature of irrationality is already presented as the deep worry of the text. And so we might even say that's the deep worry of the human being who's already trying to give rational structure to the law. That first order of the biblical text is already reflecting, can you turn an insane world into a logical structure? So the first level, we do it as the level of legal order, right? But he's going to say that the worry that even produces law is going to come to the surface through these weird folk motifs. They don't just take them as, pre-scientific folk motifs of the demonic. He's saying that is already reflecting the deep anxiety of what it means to be a human being that precedes the structures of law.
I mean, there's the tension between the rational, I would say, framework of the halakha and the theological irrational underlying level is still maintained. I mean, it would make much more sense. Levinas would make a much more compelling argument whether he would actually point out terms like the tension between the Shalat Adin, for example, and Shalat Adin when it comes to halakha.
Right.
Yeah, over there we can see that people are experiencing the ethical framework as something which must be challenged, must be questioned, because it cannot really.
But what Tzvi's talking about is supererogatory behavior. So that is taking that there's good behavior, and then there is a plus of supererogatory behavior. What he's doing is looking at it from the totally other side. He says, law is a limit which has put a kind of technical legal language over the primordial anxiety of whether life can be brought under any kind of rational structure. And so it's as if to say the Bible, the biblical mishpatim, is there to kind of put a finger in the flood, in the dike, that is the first stop against social anarchy or social anomie. Law is that first structure against social anomie, but the deep fear of anomie is still on that other side. The same way you're saying on the good side, there's many more.
I don't say on the good side.
Oh.
I mean, the Hasidim.
Right. The way of the righteous.
Their righteous is exactly one could see as a rebel or as a challenging of the normative structure. It's not about doing more.
Yeah. Okay. It is.
In that sense, it's a much more direct. It's a much more direct challenge. So it's a direct challenge to the very.
But you see, we're going to see that Levinas is going to flip it. He's going to say, if you're only righteous for yourself, and you don't take account of your neighbor, you're going to be consumed with. You're going to be the first who's going to be consumed. In other words, righteousness as a supererogatory action that's only a self-centered action, he will say, because he's going to go in the other direction. Righteousness will only be of value when it confronts the face of the other in an act of responsibility. But but righteousness is a punishment, and that's why he'll read that first issue. Righteousness is a punishment. You punish for your righteousness if your righteousness is self-regarding rather than other-regarding. Right? And I'm simply suggesting, although he doesn't spell it out this way, that the legitimacy of his reading to the cultural unconscious is already prompted by this sequence of episodes that the text is going to deal with about a mashchit, the demon, and fever and famine, which become things that swallow up the good and the evil already. So from this point of view, law, however, at whatever point law becomes a language and a cultural limit, right? It's going to betray this kind of anxiety. He's going to add actually another very interesting thing at the very beginning of his discussion. Now, there's the same way that law provides a limit against all of this, unless law takes account of the care of the other, it becomes what he calls male, the virility. Remember, he asks the totally unexpected question of why the Torah is called Rahmana, right? Now, Rahmana, when the Talmud calls the Torah Rahmana, it's God, right? It just refers to God, right? He does a remarkable reinterpretation of it. He then takes it as implying the femininity of the rechem of mercy, to mean that law as limit has to include care and righteousness within it, or it becomes a law that only serves itself but doesn't serve the face of the other, right? So he's already implying that there is a critique embedded in the term of the divine voice. Now, obviously, it's maybe a circular argument for Levinas, but it's very intriguing that what we're saying, you have to follow his own logic as a philosophical, ethical interpreter of this material. And what he's saying is that just as law is a first-order limit against social anarchy, but it retains all the anxieties of anarchy, the use of the divine name here as why God has formulated law is to counsel you that law simply as limit can be its own destruction unless it includes within itself that feminine aspect of recognizing the face of the other, which is care.
Yeah, and also it might be that he's brilliant work with Rachamim, but he wants to go to some originality, some very deep, almost deep, profound maternity, right, in which we are connected, right? I think before any law, before any codification,
right,
there is this care which is there.
Yeah, so that's why he will say, I mean, the simple way of putting it is first philosophy is not ontology, but it's ethics.
Yeah.
In the sense that if first philosophy is ontology, you care about yourself. And you care to feed yourself, to protect yourself, what he calls perseverance. If first philosophy is ethics, it means the most primal beginning point has to recognize we're all in it together. And that would prevent the fire to break out. And when the fire breaks out, it has an irrational dimension that can consume everybody. But the level before the fire could break out would be first philosophy. If there isn't first philosophy, then it's kitei seish. Then there can be this kind of inflammatory spin-off that comes from lack of care, right? So that's part of his issue of trying to totally transform Western ethics through this rabbinic text. The paradox, of course, is that he wants to transform Greek and Western ethics through a rabbinic text that he speaks about in a Western Greek way. But he's not. I'm trying to fill in the steps that he's not filling in because he's talking this kind of funny shorthand. But if you really try to give his argument the benefit of the doubt, he's then trying to do at another level what Herman Cohen was doing, right? Ethics out of the source, a philosophy of ethics out of the sources of Judaism but the sources of Judaism betray a pre-legal ethic. That is to say, it is a primordial ethic. And our texts have formulated that, but you have to wait, according to Levinas, for the Talmudic discussion to see the full teasing out of that. In other words, the biblical law is so highly condensed and rational that you can't see the worry. The worry. You can't see the anxiety because it's legal language. The Mishnah does it again from the point of view of ongoing rabbinic society. It's only when you get the human voice of the back and forth in the Gemara that you begin to see what the underlying worry is as they're trying to understand, justify, clarify, and then of the legal text, like, why this, why that? Because that's already reflecting the worry, is everything going to be contained in the law? Right? That's the first level of legal worry. Is it all going to be contained in the law, or is there excess of all the stuff that hits the fan? No. God says, because it can be contained, right? But the human voice is already showing that maybe there's stuff that's going to fling out and hit the fan. And then, in a text, his choice of a text like this or other texts that will now pick up on agadata, or the theological, is now immediately going to hit the worry at the unconscious level. And his claim is that worry is already before the Torah text of law. And it's that worry which reminds us, now you need an interpreter. That worry that primal anxiety of terror can only be stopped, not by law, but by something that precedes law. That is to say that you recognize your responsibility for the other of everything that encounters you, but particularly persons. Right? In other words, because that is ground zero. Right? Law is second story. Right? And so he's trying to help us to say that once you get past it, you get into a legal order that consumes it, which is the rationality that's irrational, right? But you have to go to something that precedes the logical level before the fire can break out, and that can only be the first order level of what it means to be a person. So, in a certain sense, it's ethics before theology. Or that ethics is a first theology, if you sense that everything that one encounters is a divine presence that one has to respond to. But he is not going to necessarily go there. But it's
He sort of very briefly and elliptically takes you there for a minute. When he says something about the infinite face of the other. On page 187, I was like, okay,
right.
Now I know. But this is 193, but perhaps this thesis is precisely a call to man's infinite, 193?
Yeah, it's a thesis is precisely
a call to man's infinite responsibility to an untiring wakefulness, to total insomnia.
Yeah, that is his Ten Commandments.
Yeah, I have a
That is the ultimate thing. In other words, what wakefulness means is that everything that you have to respond to everything that comes with a sense of infinite responsibility for it. Once you're not infinitely awake, the fire can break out, right? And once it breaks out, it can consume everything. So the worry of the law becomes, the rationality of the law is already signaling irrationality, but it requires this later discussion of the human voice to articulate. So, let's give Levinas the benefit of the doubt, even if this is an over reading of his. It's an interesting reading, but he doesn't fill in all the steps. But it implies, or the way he would say it is his language, at least in the philosophical works, is to say that we encounter the world at the level of the said. So the said, what has already been said, is scripture, right? The saying is what opens up the deal, right? The opening up of that is the discourse in rabbinic literature, which is opening up the need to recognize our responsibility to respond to the primal level. So he'll deal with that in these Heideggerian categories, but they can be remapped onto this.
Sorry, so this is like this ship sailed a long time ago, but related to the question Svi was asking, your response to it, I know they have very different sources, different audiences, but is there any chance that Lichtenstein read this before composing? Is there an ethic beyond?
No. You mean read the Gemara or read?
No, read Levinas.
I
Well,
don't.
because I know it sounds like an absurd question, but in a sense, it seems like
Rachel's referring to a famous essay by Rob Lichtenstein of does duty require have an ethic?
Yeah, is there
In other words,
beyond
is there only theological law, and is ethics simply outside the law as a kind of natural order?
This Judaism recognizing ethics separate from halacha.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I know it sounds like
he
an
wouldn't go
absurd
there,
question, but it seems like it's almost
Levinas does. Levinas does. Obviously, he recognizes an ethic, but it's the primordial. It's the primary to the law. It's not independent and so on, but you have to do a depth sounding of the halacha. In other words, the culture has been so it's a cognitive series of layers. And what the Gemara has done is it allows you to strip away the discourse in the Talmudic discussion for Levinas allows you to strip away those levels of repression of the first order level of philosophy, right?
I just made to answer Rachel. In a sense, yeah, you're right. Lichtenstein, is there an ethics independent of halacha? Yes, but it's complicated, and eventually Lichtenstein will just incorporate whatever ethics outside of halacha into halacha.
No, right. That's what I'm saying. It's like Tzvi is right. Mishrat Hadin, which is like the tool that Lichtenstein uses, like integrate all outside ethics, right? And it seems like, insofar as if you can say that Levinas's method here is to identify like a deconstructive precursor in the Gemara that he then can imitate to like say that ethics in a sense is like contained in but like primordial to and therefore transcends like legalism. That's like
itself contains attention.
No, but
external to the halacha or the halacha itself indicates a very tangible.
right. No, and I'm saying it seems like Lichtenstein, as far as he contains it in Mishrat Hadim, as opposed to in like a type of hermeneutics, is a response.
I think they're going the same way.
I think there's different things.
You wouldn't say that's the thing, but ultimately we do not regard ethics as like external to halacha in the sense that external to Judaism, but rather within halacha itself, within the structure of the law, we do indicate, within the rabbinic structure of the law, we do indicate this kind of, I would say, rupture between the kind of ethical kind of responsibility and that which is reflected also in the structures of halacha, which attempts to kind of correlate or correspond to this kind of.
So I mean, he would be closer to Rav Soloveitchik in the sense that what the halacha is helping us realize about the Torah text is our structures of social responsibility. But it's it presents that from the point of view of the theology of the law is responding to that, so that the need for the ethical and social order from the divine side. But they wouldn't go as far as Levinas, who's really trying to go to something that precedes the halacha. He's trying to get you to a first philosophy.
Right.
Right? And for that other position is that the philosophy of the ethical is embedded within the halachic discourse.
I mean, Levinas could live very nice.
And that's its truth. That's its a priori truth.
Its a priori truth is
For
Lifnei
Rav
Mishar
Soloveitchik
Hadin
and
as
Rav
opposed to like the face of the other
Right.
or something.
I mean, for Levinas, it would be, is there a halacha without ethics? Or rather, sorry, is there an ethics without halacha? Yeah, sure. Right, not for Rav Soloveitchik or Rav Lichtenstein,
Right.
right? I mean, you just cannot separate the two at all.
All right, let's just do a couple. Let's just do a couple of these other things before we come to the end. So let's just. So Rachel, were you already doing that? Let's just take a couple. Let's just do a couple of these odd ones, like Rabbi Joseph, Rabbi Yosef.
On 348?
Yeah.
Okay. Rabbi Joseph learnt, "What is the meaning of the verse? And none of you shall go out at the door of his house until the morning." Once permission has been granted to the destroyer, he does not distinguish between righteous and wicked. Moreover, he begins with the righteous at the very outset, as it says, I will cut off from thee the righteous and the wicked. Rabbi Joseph wept at this, saying, "So much are they compared to nothing." But Abaye, consoling him, said, "This is for their advantage, as it is written, that the righteous is taken away from the evil to come."
All right. So you can see that probably Rav Yosef's teaching has been linked here for what reason? What's the ostensible reason? What's the ostensible editorial reading for the linking of this tradition about the mashchit, about the destroyer?
From the perspective of Levinas, or
What?
the perspective
No,
of
for the Gemara, for the stam. Like was he just had a bad dream or?
the absurdity.
No. He says quite clearly that it begins with the righteous.
Which is into cry, because from God doesn't cry. It begins with righteous because of the ethical, because of the question of the
Right, but I'm
ethical.
saying in terms of the logic of the editor, the issue between the preceding teaching, which is directly on theme because it's quoting from Shmot, from Exodus, and this one, which looks like it's off the wall, is linked at the level of another teaching that's dealing with, it begins with the righteous. And it becomes another meditation on the problem of theodicy, or dealing with the suffering of the righteous first. And I will cut off thee the righteous and the wicked, and then so now then it begins to unfold through this particular little episode a much deeper anxiety that will allow Levinas to ride this wave even further. So there is a logical connection, right? There is a logical connection between the first homily, which is talking about beginning with the righteous, and this one, simply at the level of a thematic phrase. But now the content of this will take us into a deeper anxiety about this, because Rabbi Yosef went and said that the righteous and the wicked are consumed altogether, even if it begins the other one. Like ultimately there's no distinction, right? And Abai tries to console him that the righteous is taken away from the evil to come. But it's a consolation that isn't. But you see, now we begin to get to the notion where we see that rational theodicies are deconstructing themselves, right? This when Rabbi Yosef cries and he said, "Well, now everybody's, what have you helped me here? Now everybody's being consumed." In other words, there becomes a second order logic. The first order logic is what you would say the editorial concatenation of materials. The first concatenation of materials is the homily said it breaks out with the righteous. It begins with the tzaddik. So this next teaching of Rabbi Yosef is on a totally other subject, but it deals with it beginning with the righteous. Once that hook has been made simply at the level of tradition to remember a related tradition. It opens up a new theological concern that deepens the first concern, namely that it states at the level of true anxiety that both are consumed at the same time. Right? The first one sort of kept a little bit away from that, right? And then let's see. Let's go on to then Rav Yehuda says, you reading, Rachel? Okay.
Rav Yehuda stated that Rab said, "A man should always enter a town by daytime and leave by daytime, as it says, and none of you shall go out of the door of his house until the morning."
Okay, and so then we have a whole series of issues of going into a space, out of a space, if the space is dangerous on the outside, and if the space is dangerous on the inside. Should you stay in the inside, and what should you do? Now you have a whole series of texts now that become a chain of association, but each deepens this notion of the consuming, ravaging quality of the anxiety of destruction. In other words, that becomes the new hyper-theological motif that it covers outside and inside. And now it shifts from the level of fire to the level of plague and to the level of war. In other words, it deepens, it touches on all those levels of anxiety. And then it deals with if there's an epidemic, should you walk in the middle of the street? So you walk in the middle of the street, and then the demons will be on the side of the street. But if it's a different time of time, then you can walk on the side of the street. But then the Gemara begins, as Levinas will say, that becomes an even deeper anxiety. It means that there is evil lurking at all times. Sometimes evil consumes the middle of the way, and you have to try to get to the side away from it. And sometimes evil is on the side, and it's also consuming. So, in other words, Levinas tries to unpack, deconstruct the deepest theological anxieties as he goes from one episode to the other. There's no distinction between day and night. There's no distinction between inside and outside. There's no distinction between running inside your home to running to the camp of the enemy. Like when it breaks out, there's no clear rationality, right? And if you try to run inside to a safe space, then he will, like to a study hall, he says, then he will deconstruct that. He says, if you go to a safe space and people are not studying, you're using religion as a way to hide from your responsibility on the outside. And so what he'll do is he will constantly use one episode after this. So let's simply go to the very end. So each one of these episodes has its own inner logical connection, simply at an associative level of connecting traditions that are all dealing with plagues, destruction, and so on and so forth. But what they do is they magnify the issue of a primordial anxiety that consumes, that elemental aspect. And now he's going to come to, let's just go to the very end, and then we will maybe have a larger discussion of the whole thing. So let's pick up with Rabbi Ami. So Rachel, why don't you pick up with that on page 350 on the left side, left column. You have that?
Yes.
Okay.
When Rabbi Amni and Rabbi Asi were sitting before Rabbi Isaac the smith,
right,
one of them said to him, "Will the master please tell us some legal points?"
Of course, this is kind of a remarkable thing because Yitzchak Napacha, he was a blacksmith, but of course blacksmiths have sparks that fly and create fires, right? Okay. Okay.
"Will the master please tell us some legal points?" Well, the other said, "Will the master please give us some homiletical instruction?"
So now what they're trying to do, so this becomes the closure of that sequence of one wanted a philosophical explanation or homiletical theologian, the other wanted a legal one. Okay? We saw at the very first homily they were brought together. Okay, so now.
When he commenced a homiletical discourse, he was prevented by the one, and when he commenced a legal discourse, he was prevented by the other. He therefore said to them, I will tell you a parable. To what is this like? To a man who has 2 wives, one young and one old. The young one used to pluck out his white hair, whereas the old one used to pluck out his black hair. He thus finally remained bald on both sides. He further said to them, I will accordingly tell you something which will be equally interesting to both of you.
This is a famous thing, kirech mikana, right? So, and of course, it's fantastic, isn't it? So no, let it not be said that the Talmud doesn't have like a vaudeville sense of humor. It's a great sense of course, Levinas goes after it for another way. He used it a cultural critique. He said, the young ones want to pluck out the gray hair because they want religion to always to be updated and new. The old ones pluck out the white hair because the old ones pluck out the black hair because they want the tried and true to be the only thing that remains. All right. Anyway, so the famous is kerech mikana mikana. So this kind of guy is totally bald. He can't satisfy both of his wives. Can you imagine putting this on a bud? I mean, this would be a Borscht Belt scene. Wouldn't this be a fantastic scene on the Borscht Belt? The Poconos. Can you imagine Jackie Mason performing this? Oh, it's very good. Yeah, right. I mean, if they did this as a kind of spoof, it's a real Borscht Belt spoof, right? Okay.
If fire break out and catch in thorns, break out implies of itself. He that kindled.
I said now he's going to give a homily that deals with both, right? Okay.
He that kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. The Holy One, blessed be He, said, it is incumbent upon me to make restitution for the fire which I kindled. It was I who kindled the fire in Zion, as it says, and he hath kindled the fire in Zion which hath devoured the foundations thereof, and it is I who will one day build it anew by fire, as it says, for I, saith the Lord, will be unto her a wall of fire round about, and I will be the glory in the midst of her.
Okay, so now you can see simply at the level of this homily another horizon of concern that's involved here. That is to say, the issue of theodicy that was at the deepest level of concern was the destruction of the temple. That destroyed the holy and the unholy at the same time, right? That consumed the righteous and the unrighteous. And now you have a homily that is in part judgment. It's a brilliant homily. It's both judgmental and consoling at the same time. It blames God for destroying this, and God takes responsibility, and it becomes, again, when it happens. It's not an if it happens. God takes responsibility, and then God gives ultimate consolation by using another text of consolation, that he will build a ring of fire. The same way that fire destroyed, now fire will be a wall of protection. So it becomes the concern that's clearly bothering Yitzchak Napacha is the great destruction of the temple and the scattering of Israel and the consuming of the holy and the unholy. And this is directly blamed on God, and the consolation now in this remarkable homily is that God takes responsibility and God makes restitution. So it becomes a theology of redemptive care presented through the legal structure that the one who causes this will have to pay. So so now the text is placed upon God that all the destruction that God has caused at this intentional level will have to be paid for by God in recompense to Israel, right? And now we look at the legal text. Now we'll take it one step further. Okay, so what does the legal text say? On the legal side, last three lines.
On the legal side.
This is shmata. In other words, it's actually kind of the oral legal tradition.
The verse commences with damage done by chattel and concludes with damage done by the person, in order to show that the fire implies also human agency.
Okay, so in this particular case, that is to say, it begins with niske isho. That is to say, it begins with accidental damages, when things simply break out, kite se ish, right? In other words, it's giving a new level of rationality to the law, and then it continues by saying that the person is responsible even for what we'd say collateral damage. So it's called gire, right? Gire are like the arrows or the offshoots of something. So anything I do that even if it has unintended consequences, I am legally responsible. That's gire isho, which means my arrows for my bow, legal, that's a legal concept. The arrows of my bow are mine. So from this point of view, I'm responsible for collateral damage that was initiated by me, right? So it's, no matter how far it goes down the line, the initiator now has this.
This returns back to Nabcha.
Right.
Kind of a self-critique or you have the one is actions.
Right. In other words, they got the divine action, so the two things become together.
I mean, he's continuing himself. It's for Nabcha. Eshem is from Chitzah.
Yeah. At the beginning.
In the beginning, going back to his own name by speaking about their result.
Yeah, so it kind of brings this whole thing back together. So now the question, so we don't have to go through all the cases of Levinas, but you can see that for Levinas, the sequence of materials are not just a series, even if they were at one level a series of only loosely connected episodes about war and famine and plague, he sees this as reflecting a deeper psychologic, right? And the deeper psychologic is going to the deeper anxiety that both precedes the law and that also answers his modern ethical concern. So his modern ethical concern is that just as these legal texts are showing us that once evil breaks out, it consumes everyone and it's an elemental force and you can't hide from it, whether you're inside, outside, no matter what you're doing. And so from that point of view, everything rots, and as he says, it stinks of Auschwitz from the very beginning, and that once it breaks out, even the rationality of these structures is irrational because it embeds within itself, it's a destructive force. He then would want to say the only way the modern person can deal with that is to come to terms with what precedes the outbreak of the fire, right? Before even that first order rationality of law, which is the other. So that's why he will read, for example, if you're a righteous person, it begins with you because you're punished for your righteousness. You're only focusing on yourself and you didn't focus on another person. So the same way that you don't see, that he then reads it allegorically, the same way that they don't see the suffering of the other, they will die, their punishment is mirroring their moral culpability of not seeing the suffering of the other. Or the same way as a person flees inward to a study hall, that's a person who flees into religion without serving the needs of society. In other words, he uses each one of these episodes to give a kind of moral gloss which provides his philosophical appropriation. It becomes a philosophical allegory that reappropriates each of these episodes, and that depends on his understanding that the primary concern of the legal and the rabbinic text is an ethical concern from the very beginning that's trying to contain irrationality in society. So therefore, each one of his modern explanations of the evasion of responsibility is legitimate from his point of view, because those are explaining how we continue the evasion of responsibility, which is the primary concern of our biblical, Mishnaic, and rabbinic text. And so from that point of view, you would have to say that Levinas continued, although it's a philosophical allegory, he's continuing in a valid tradition of ethical, legal, homiletic interpretation, rather than simply say, as one could say, that he's imposing a modern philosophical ethic onto the text. The question I think that you have to ask him, or we have to ask, is that every interpreter is going to say, what is the presupposition that underlies the text that we're dealing with? So from his point of view, the deep presupposition is the move from the anxiety of life and either pre-thematic responsibility or disregard, or attempting to contain it at the level of law. And so he would say, I think, to us that he has the right to deconstruct this material because he's recovering at the human level, at the level of human ethics. He's not interested in theological. That the text is reflecting the escape from responsibility into law by trying to create an artificial metapersonal nomos. And he's trying to use the Talmudic discussion to bring us back to our personal responsibility for the law and what we've done with the law. And it's not simply abstract nomos, it has to be personal ethics. Benny.
What do you think he would say about his justification for legal and hermeneutical continuity? How would he justify that he's part of
I think
tradition
he hints at it here, and he says it in a couple of other places. He would say that there is a deep cultural logic in the editing of material in any sugya, in any pericope. And it may not be obvious at the surface level. At the surface level, you might simply say, it's simply an attempt to link superficially related traditions in an anthology of traditions that are really unrelated. So he says that the tradition of reading he got from Rav Shoshani, which was the teacher that he had after the war, was that the sequence of elements in a sugya, in the pericope, has a theological, ethical, deep structure. And it's the task of the interpreter to try to reconstruct the ethical logic that's being concealed here. So it's deconstructive precisely because culture masks in other words, the primal forgetting is not the forgetting of being, it's the forgetting of the face of the other. And the forgetting of the face of the other is the concrete person of the other. The first level of forgetting is to move from the face of the other to the abstract law, right? Which creates, ki yetzeish, so it becomes an abstract. The Mishnah even presents it at a more abstract level. So these are levels which are forgetting first order ethics. That's how I think Levinas would say it. It's not just you forget being, because forgetting being, he would say people haven't forgotten being because they are concerned with themselves. They're concerned with maintaining their life and their private needs and their private concerns. But they've really, and that's what produces the fire. Because everybody is contesting over who's going to eat it, whose land it is, who owns it. That's the level of ontology that is the fire. That's the elemental in a certain sense. And if people may have forgotten that at a certain level, but they're living it out. And the only way is to get to a deeper forgetting that will save us. The deeper forgetting that will save us is the ethical, right? You may have forgotten the question of being, but we haven't, in a certain sense, repressed the need for being. And it's precisely the need for being which is the fire that breaks out, that consumes everything. My land, it's my place, it's my food. I need it more than you, I won't give it up, right? It's a zero-sum game, right? That is, you may forget the philosophical question of being, but people have forgotten the primordial drive of being. The only way to undercut that at the political level, like this is my space, not your space, right? The only way to resolve that at that primal level of being is to go to a deeper level that has been forgotten. And that is to break through ontology, which is our natural endowment, to a transcendence which is ethical. And that requires, so the question, a question that I would ask of Levinas is, the first order ontology is our first fear. It's of eating, dying, all of these issues. The question is whether first philosophy as ethics has to be taught. In other words, whether that recovery, because you'd say, how would I know that when I look in the face of the other that I'm responsible for them, as opposed that they're taking up the space of my world and that I need what they have? His claim is not asking that question. His claim is to say to the question that every return to the face of the other is a transcendence that breaks out of the raw fire of ontology. The question that I'm simply posing is whether that has to be cultivated by culture. And what would it mean to say that the ethical is primary if at our most primary level we have a need for food?
Yeah, I mean, what he's trying to retrieve that otherness through all kinds of reifications and iterations.
Right.
Specifically the different laws in Judaism, right? But he's not discarding it, but he's trying to retrieve that original otherness, ultimately, which is the otherness of the divine, is the first call of the ultimate other, I think. And I think that exercise, I think he shows.
But do we know that? Do we know that primordially, or do we have to, or is it the task of culture to cultivate that breakthrough?
Yeah. But that cultivation, I think that the brilliance of Levinas to show that these good cultivations always end up in reifications.
Right.
Which-
That's
That's
the law. That's the law.
Think about
That's the law.
With politically correctness today, how that becomes such an oppressive reification. Wanting to correct and to be ethical, right? And use of Levinas today would be brilliant to show that indeed it's not enough to codify to stop racism. It's never enough. Racism is indeed not about saying the right word. Not being racist is not about not saying or saying the correct words in the correct circumstances, but actually being able to meet this. My students always complain when they go to UIC how it's not diverse, although we talk about diversity all the time. Like, ideology of diversity is there, thriving. There's no diversity indeed, because this is exactly what Levinas talks about. How the discourse of diversity ends up stifling the true encounter with the other. And this is why it's brilliant, and that in return has always to be performed. It's never a given, it cannot be reified, and it cannot be legalized precisely.
The question is, how do you come to that awareness? Let's say your first level of awareness is your mother's face when she's breastfeeding you.
Yeah.
It's not alterity, it's sameness, right? I mean, how would you distinguish between the source of nurture and that it's outside? It's part of a much larger ambience. I'm just asking, how do you get to the level of alterity that is a moral alterity as a primary feature? I think the only way that I could imagine it, I mean, and correct me, I'm trying, is at the first level of terror, where things just are different, they're other. And I become aware of radical otherness at this level of mysterium tremendum. In other words, that's my first rupture, that I have to see things as different, and then I begin to cultivate a respect for difference. But I have to have something that brings me into the consciousness of difference, right? That can be a productive, that dialectically can result in ethics. And I'm just thinking out loud that I think it's the mysterium tremendum that precedes the fascinans. In other words, there is the first level in which I have to understand real difference and separation, and then the yearning to establish a relationship with those things dialectically related, but after the fact. The question is, how could you start? How could you start with the ethical position primordially?
What I find fascinating with regard to the question, the role of tradition with regard to ethics. What would be? So he goes back to tradition, goes back to the rabbinic tradition, attempts to kind of carry out his own reading. Not only in the sense of an exercise. I mean, he would claim that it's not only an exercise, although one can claim that it's an exercise. But he would actually claim that it's this particular tradition, the Judaism, the rabbinic kind of tradition, which he kind of encounters in the text, provides him with the ability to develop his own international ethics.
Right.
So in a sense, there's kind of a tension between this need to kind of free himself from binding himself to given tradition, speaking about ethics in terms of the primordial responsibility. Yet at the same time, it is only a particular tradition, a very particular tradition.
So you're agreeing with me. In other words, you have to come at it through a tradition that might already say love your neighbor as yourself or something like that. In other words, that's already at the level of cultural instruction.
Exactly. There must be something that precedes that.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. That's what I'm asking. Because even if he starts, in other positions he would start with the Rosenzweigian position. You begin in a relationally, but relationally doesn't necessarily imply alterity. It simply means that we're caught in an original connection. I can't think of myself independent of you. That doesn't mean that I have embedded in that an ethical respect for your difference.
I mean, let's talk about a good example of fear of death, which really kind of establishes an entire kind of ethical responsibility, whatever he kind of develops later on, not as this kind of anxiety which cannot be reduced or identified with a particular type of.
So that, but that, then you're, but see, but then you'd agree with my argument. If you say the fear of death is the first anxiety of the mysterium tremendum, then I might say my next response is a co-responsibility with another. But then I develop a relationship, maybe first out of self-centered need, and then ultimately I see you as a person in your own right.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm trying to understand, because especially the evidence who actually claims in Garden philosophy insists on this notion of the breaking, the shattering of the world of the dreams. The world of the dreams is nothing but my tradition, what I experience, what I identify as my own tradition, my own experience, and so forth. And it's only through the sharing of that world of the dreams that we can actually arrive at the other and the real ethical set demand. And that's why I'm kind of, I really do not understand why Levinas and how Levinas engages with rabbinic tradition.
He doesn't. He
No,
doesn't.
he does. I mean, ultimately,
He's not engaged with it. He's
not engaged. Okay,
No.
but it's not just. I mean, it's not just an exercise. There's something there. He needs something in within the tradition itself which enables him to carry out
His philosophical project.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Which is.
He wants to
Very-
bring us back to something more primordial. The question is whether that primordial thing has. In other words, he's claiming that there's a pre-thematic,
Yeah.
but embedded in the pre-thematic is thematic.
No, but he
Yeah.
needs the framework of the Judaic tradition, for example, to get to that pre-thematic. You cannot have the pre-thematic.
Of course, we can't recover it otherwise. He's trying to recover phenomenologically something that precedes intentionality. He wants to precede the noema, the noesis, and the noema. He wants to get something deeper than a mental relationship with something else.
So it's already cultural, but
Yeah,
you
but-
have to retrieve through the culture of that. So
Wait, but in a certain sense, the argument beats itself because
The argument, what?
Levinas, right? In the sense that if Levinas is arguing from within the Jewish tradition, regardless of what his philosophical premise might be, he's still arguing from within a given tradition.
Right.
But why does that beat itself? I mean, he's
No,
challenging.
because take the traditional structure out of the question. He's left with.
He cannot.
No, but the challenge.
Of course he can.
He's challenging.
That's exactly the thing.
And exactly-
Of course he
you-
can.
you-
All he's left is with his own ethical premise.
Which
He-
has
he-
not.
No, he could do it perfectly without his.
But he always refers to Judaism in all his writings.
What do you mean?
It's not, it's not, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. And it's the religion of the.
Take out rabbinic Judaism according to Levinas from Levinas's ethical premise. Would his ethical premise work? Yes.
That's a question. That is a
They-
question.
No,
I mean, he would say
No,
yes.
Why not? He came to his rabbinic.
Because
Talmudic-
no,
wait,
but-
wait. He came to this rabbinic Talmudic readings relatively late.
No, but no, it's not about it's not about this particular rabbinical reading. It's about the question is whether or not ultimately his philosophy of theology. That's the question. Whether there's a theology within his philosophy. The fact that he develops ethics, right, and he speaks about God, speaks about a theological tradition, and another which attempts to develop an ethical conception of the infinite and so forth, implies implies his engagement with a particular tradition.
For Levinas, not for the tradition.
No, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
it's redundant in that way. I mean, truth being told, it's an addition, it's an ornament that could be taken out and the system would be consistent. It's a sort of additional justification which never worked for me with Levinas.
Wait, what are you saying? What are you saying is additional, Lenny? You're saying that Judaism is the dish?
No, for Levinas.
for Levinas,
Judaism
but I
is
think-
in
Wait, one at a time so we can all understand. Wait. First, Rachel,
Yeah, I agree.
Benny respond to Rachel, and then because
I wanted to clarify.
I only have 2 ears. and
Are you suggesting that the additional, like, non-essential element of Levinas's ethics is his adding Judaism on top?
Yes.
It's like
To make
So this is-
let Benny answer. David, let Benny answer first. And then
To make,
Do you agree with me?
wait a minute. Benny is talking.
thank
He
you.
has the floor.
Sorry.
To bring back the question of Leo Strauss and the tension between Athens and Jerusalem, he's an Athenian who happened to add Jerusalem as sort of a very non-essential ornament to.
So that was a very fancy yes.
that's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Can I say? But I think he's brilliant because maybe he realizes that indeed in totality and infinity, in the other way, you might have him just having it is just he's doing the retrieval of the other somewhat in vacuum. I think this is brilliant because he realizes that we are all already culturally, ethically embedded. So indeed, he as a Jew does it with the Talmudic readings. I as a Christian might do it within certain Christian layers. But the task for him and myself is the same. Namely, I have always to avoid the reification of theodicy. And to explain, I have to avoid explaining away this angst, this deep abyss, which is always there. And that abyss can become Auschwitz, or it can become otherness. And so we always have that task, and that's why it's brilliant. It's not a cosmetic addition. He's showing you how do you do it from someone.
Sure, but I think the question is when you get back to the cultural levels, he's trying to get us back to responsibility, but what that responsibility is already inflected by the cultural notion. It's the way in the other class we're talking about Schleiermacher, right? There is that first level of primary experience, which he says is already theological, already implies a certain kind of cultural understanding of what he's already experiencing. So maybe we can't. Maybe we just have to take that using the embeddedness in culture, we try to go as far back as we can go and to try to take something that is not natural but that precedes culture at another level. And that we would call it maybe the pre-thematic, is maybe not pre-theological. In other words, it's not natural and it's not cultural. It's that first moment. And he wants to see that the Sinai before Sinai is the face of the other. And so in a certain sense, he's trying to retrieve an ethic from modernity. And it's not, in other words, we're never getting to the primordial. We're getting as close to our human point of responsibility as we can, right? So all I'm just saying is that there's a claim that he's making that can't be supported even if you go with him, right?
But he doesn't even try. He's always aiming. It's like a tangential. He's aware. He's thinking with that primordial, right? But he's never even attempting to reify or legalize it precisely because he says that would be a mistake to do.
So maybe that helps us understand what the face of what pre-thematic means. At the point that you get to the thematic, you're already at the level of language, justification, and the law. And the face becomes the closest you can come to the non-ideational, namely the concreteness, which is not a theme. It just is that makes a claim upon you. Because any next move, it's sort of like it's Kafka's great problem in some of his diaries, can you have a philosophy that's not a consolation? Everything that you would ever say provides a consolation because it provides a justification and explanation, right? So in a certain sense, he's saying, can you ever get beyond philosophy as a consolation, that it gives you some sense of solace in the world? So the face is an anxiety, it's concrete, it doesn't have, it has embedded in it its own imperative, but it's not a theme, it's not law. So in other words, it's taking the tradition to the point where the truth of this tradition, namely ethical issues, touches ground zero, but it's not at the thematic level. Maybe that's what we have to understand by the pre-thematic, that it's not primordial in that sense, but it's something about ethics that precedes the formulation of law and ethics. Because once you do that, you've created the Bible or the Mishnah. You have norms which are in the third person and not in the first person or the second, or the I thou. The I thou is not the third person. Law is in the third person.
You raised it.
Right? Yeah. So then maybe that might be the way to understand the ultimate concern of the pre-thematic. It's not to get us to something that is radically primordial before all traditions, but something through the traditions that we always already have to be in, to the recognition that the traditions that we're in, even if they're ethical, are already formulated as third-person ethical maxims, statements, laws, and norms, and to come to the realization that there are things that can compel us that can't be, that precede nomos as an umbrella statement, right? Maybe, I think that might be, at least it helps me in the sense that I had always struggled with, primordial not in the temporal sense, but primordial in the axiological sense, in the sense of value. This is where we get, before we can say that law now formulates it this way, puts nomos, puts it in the third person, makes it a norm for everybody, etc., but it takes me away from the being awake at all times for everything that's happening. So I think it's a different way of conceiving this pre-thematic. Maybe it's closer to I thou. It's really the I thou moment as opposed to I it, which is the thematic.
It's very Buber.
Yeah, I think in that sense, that's maybe what the pre-thematic is. It's the thou that's gegen Uber, that's over against you, and makes a claim.
What he's doing here is very similar to Buber's Herut.
Yeah.
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 Can I ask you a question? Do you know of anything similar from a modern Christian theological tradition in the 20th century? It could have been done in that tradition.
Heidegger does something similar with Christianity.
Sorry?
Heidegger does something similar with Christianity. He reads it into the first question of philosophy and theology. But not really.
Who are you talking about?
Heidegger.
Yeah, but he's not Christian.
He's very rich in different, but the structure, the philosophical structure is very similar.
I would say maybe Marion is similar to that.
Who?
But Marion, he's doing, but he's expanding in a way.
Now in his work with the Church
He's
Fathers.
responding.
Yeah, because I think Levinas, when you say ethical, Levinas doesn't mean a restrictive thing, ethical as opposed to, let's say, metaphysical. It is that primordial field or level, the ethical, the otherness.
And Marion was deeply influenced by Levinas,
Yeah,
so that may be the...
He was with the givenness, that's
Right.
his concept of givenness, which is an expansion of the otherness. It's exactly that. So in a way, he's trying to retrieve, and those reading the you were in the past,
Exactly.
and you were, hermeneutically, it's very, sometimes you wonder where he pulls it from, but
He said it was open.
And you are annoyed.
I would say the same thing. It diminishes in a certain sense the importance or the centrality of tradition for tradition itself. Because
It's instrumental to
if the law is instrumental for tradition, the law in itself is the tradition in a certain sense. Even if it hasn't been so all the time, it became so. Right? If tradition begins from Genesis, God creating the world before Torah, it is still within the boundaries of the divine revelation. It doesn't matter what happened before. What matters is what is already embedded within the first revelation, this primordial revelation. And so if this primordial revelation already includes this level of ethics, it is not ethics any longer. It is already revelation. And so it's already embedded within tradition. And so trying to take this outside of it.
But he's not. There's not one primordial revelation. There are all these thou moments that are fundamental to culture. The culture is always a step away from God's word.
Certainly, but in this particular case, talking about theodicy, this would all be very nice and good if tradition itself did not talk about theodicy. And for example, if Leibniz tries to annul theodicy out of its content, right? Not being able to talk about the rationality of theodicy and so on and so forth. I mean, the Mishnah and Brachot already said that one must bless on the bad the same way he blesses on the good. In a sense, this theodicy is already embedded deeply within the tradition. Any attempt to annul it,
He wants to annul it completely. He wants it to remind us.
But he's speaking also as a modern person.
right?
So from his point of view, any justification of when this breaks out, he just finds obscene. From his point of view, this is obscene after Auschwitz. It wasn't obscene for the rabbis,
Right.
but for Levinas it's obscene. So he's trying to make you aware of how impossible it is to do theodicy, that the text itself, he's choosing texts that are showing the complication of that, and then he wants to tell you what is the most primary thing before the fire that breaks out. And that is to be awake to whatever calls us to responsibility.
Yes. Tradition will call us God. He will call it ethics. It's two
He's
different.
calling it, well, it's whatever face addresses you. Things too, it's not, but anyway, so anyway, this has been I think I myself have come a lot closer to seeing him within the tradition in a certain way than I might have done at an earlier stage. Because I think you have to just, if you see these middle steps and that he's part of this tradition, he is a later day commentator that has to be understood with another series of presuppositions that are reading these texts and trying to...
Yes. And he sees the rabbi using this. That's why it's very compelling in a way of the dialogue, because you have the question is because the way the rabbis do it, they keep that openness there.
Yeah, and he also says at one point in one of the texts, I think that Rachel read, that he wants to keep the question of responsibility open. That the sequence of different episodes, he says, complicate any rationality of the rationalities. They complicate and deconstruct themselves. So their very contradictoriness keeps the question of the problem alive, which means that it opens up that space for the ethical responsibility. Because it refuses to close around a clear, rational theodicy. Okay. Yes, David.
Just a question. I'm wondering if a year ago you've given the class on Levinas's Talmudic readings, and I'm wondering if your position has changed since. There you had. We did, exactly, and I'm wondering if you see this text in a different view. You mentioned that you're willing to incorporate Levinas now into the tradition, and that was definitely not your position.
No, I think I've changed my.
Okay.
Thinking through today's class, I think I came to a different position. But see, everybody can change.
No,
In other words, I was more focused on the gaps and the ethical moves the rhetorical moves he was making that were inspired by his philosophy after the fact, rather than seeing the fact that I think he was closer to understanding a kind of inner logic. It's a vicious circle. He found an inner logic that confirms a deep concern that he has. So I think I've changed my position on him in this respect.
no, it helps to clarify.
I mean, because it becomes, I think it may be trivial simply to say that he is just misusing or he's using the rabbinic text as a proof text. He needs the text to think. He needs the text to think. And therefore there is a deep entwinement between himself and the text that can't be separated.
But not just to think, I think there's a way back into that level. I think he cannot do it because that's a little bit tricky to put in mind with Levinas. Okay, how do I do it? You be totalitarian infini, and how do I perform this? And I think the way he proves it with the text is brilliant. That the text becomes, or the various levels become conduits.
Right.
And
I think it's so deeply entwined. I see the entwinement as opposed to the fact that he's sort of bringing his philosophy onto this. They're intimately integrated. It's not even a vicious circle. They've become so co-embedded that you can say that he has his philosophy and he has the Talmudic readings, but when he does the Talmudic readings, he does it from the inside out, not from the outside in. So there still is the philosophy that stands by itself,
Right.
but the text that he chooses to interpret, there's such a deep and brilliant entwinement that I think you have to recognize that. And as you have to see him on the spectrum of a modern Jewish thinker from that point of view, and not just that he is Athens, who then puts on the cloak. When he's doing this, the two become one, even though he's also Athens.
And this is something like trying to different from Daria, for example, who defines identifies as a Jew and so far that he cannot identify as a Jew. It's very nationalistic.
Yeah.
Which is weird. And the last two with this experience so far that. Yeah.
But would you think it's similar, like, or how comparing it to Buber's attempt? Would you show some?
I think in both of these cases there's a deep intuition that they're doing what most philosophers do in the modern age. They're creating a new Judaism out of the sources of the West and Judaism. I mean, that's why a lot of people who grow up in the tradition find it distant and alien, but they're creating new forms of Judaism for the modern age who share that problematic. And so you have to share that problematic, because it is, Rosenzweig's Judaism never existed before. There's a new form of Judaism. He invents new forms of a way of understanding ritual.
Yes, Levin Hasidim has a very critique on Buber. Conceptualization. I think that appears. And it will appear, I think, in one of the somewhere with 3 but he refers to it. He definitely has one of the one of his interviews. He will tell exactly what he would endorse from Buber and where he went.
Speaking of the Buber's down as identical to the
Is that what?
His critique is that Buber's down is identical with the eye. And therefore, you need the other to break the eye. It goes
Well, and Buber in turn could tell Levinas.
Except for his spouse. His spouse is the ultimate. No,
sure, but then Buber will tell Levinas. No, I'm saying Buber will tell Levinas that your infinite responsibility in the case of the other is effectively an appropriation. You would never even reach. Truly, never reach. And you can never even return to yourself. So there is no even distinction between the eye and the self.
What's always going to be in terms of Levinas as a phenomenologist, right? And yet it's kind of, you should be this sort of distinction, this sort of anatomy as well. So therefore, you cannot.
We're kind of the some positions, but effectively, I think that.
But the movie is similar to Buber.
Well, Buber,
especially in their interpretation.
I mean, Buber is in between the mirror down, right? And Levinas can never be there in between.
You never reached in between.
In between entails, again, the eye. Not the design. And Levinas, anyways, I
Buber would be more, I think, true to his own existential voyage. Because you can return back to the self for Levinas.
Yeah, I see.
The self is annihilate.
I'm not you are able to solve the metaphysics. I mean,
how so? You have this.
I think it's a fact. I think it's kind of the direct move. The metaphysics in the first place must be silent. And so far, metaphysics is basically the world of drink, right? It's my own stuff.
But once you meet the face of the other, how do you disconnect?
It's not that you arrive at this kind of radical, say, self-notification. I don't think so. I think ultimately the mathematical claim that you do return back to the vision, to your own instruction, metaphysics, to be granted and reestablished, and that amount comes out.
Well, then you just create another, yet another encounter, which will lead yet to another, to another infinite. I read because if the self is not the same self, okay, we'll just create another infinite responsibility in the face of the same other with the other.
I think many areas which are concepts which results from the return metaphysics ultimately leads us to explain that we can actually establish metaphysics which results from our attempt to overcome solipsism and the other, and then we can turn to true metaphysics. That would be the main between.
But that actually never happens.
Right. I mean, that
never happens.
Okay, I'm hearing the applause. I want to go down to the Sandy Novak has retired.
Yes,
Right now. Yes, I want to go down. So get me your final papers when you can. You have the Buber thing. You can read it on your own and have great pleasure. It's a beautiful teaching.
You know the question of the Voyager when they sent something to space. What did they put in?
No.
The shuttle, they put back and all of that. So we have the question, what do we want to send to our brothers and sisters in Iraq?
yeah.
So at least the scientists we can get tomorrow from us. So we can take it back.
All right.
Yeah, but
He bought you a present.
Me?
Yeah.
for the Russian people.
I will.
I scanned the whole book, Adrian. I just scanned the whole